There are moments in human history when a single discovery shatters everything we thought we understood about ourselves, our origins, and the very timeline of civilization itself. And in October 1994, on a sun-scorched hilltop in southeastern Turkey, a local farmer named Şafak Yildiz was walking across his land when his foot struck something that would unravel 12,000 years of carefully constructed academic certainty about when humanity supposedly crawled out of caves and began the long, arduous journey toward becoming what we consider civilized. That stone, that single limestone protrusion jutting from the earth like a fossilized finger pointing toward forgotten heavens, was attached to something that shouldn't exist according to every textbook, every timeline, every confident assertion we've made about our ancestors and their capabilities. It was attached to a massive T-shaped pillar standing sentinel in the Turkish soil. And that pillar was part of a temple complex so sophisticated, so precisely engineered, and so impossibly ancient, that when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in 1995 and the carbon dating results came back, the entire archaeological establishment had what can only be described as a collective intellectual crisis. Because the dates placed this monumental structure at approximately 9,600 BCE, which means it was already 6,000 years old when the first stones of the Great Pyramid of Giza were being quarried. Already ancient when Stonehenge was just a twinkle in some Neolithic architect's eye. And utterly inexplicable, given that the people who built it were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers who hadn't yet discovered pottery, hadn't developed writing, hadn't domesticated animals beyond the dog, and certainly hadn't figured out how to organize the massive labor force and advanced engineering knowledge required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect megaliths weighing up to 20 tons each, with nothing but stone tools and, presumably, sheer determination. The site that would come to be known as Göbekli Tepe, which translates rather prosaically to Potbelly Hill, contains at least 20 circular stone enclosures, though only a fraction have been excavated, because the Turkish government and archaeological community have, quite sensibly, decided that rushing to uncover everything would be catastrophically irresponsible when we barely understand what we're looking at in the first place, and what we are looking at defies every comfortable assumption about the linear progression of human development from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex, from crude to refined. To put this in perspective that might penetrate the fog of archaeological jargon and date ranges that tend to make eyes glaze over, imagine if tomorrow someone discovered a perfectly functioning smartphone buried in the foundation stones of a medieval cathedral in France, complete with touchscreen, operating system, and wireless connectivity, still powered and operational after 600 years. That's the level of temporal impossibility we're dealing with when we confront Göbekli Tepe. Because this structure demonstrates organizational capacity, artistic sophistication, astronomical knowledge, and engineering prowess that supposedly wouldn't exist for another 6,000 years. And the people who built it then did something even more confounding than the construction itself. They buried it, deliberately, completely, importing thousands upon thousands of tons of rubble and sediment to fill in every chamber, cover every pillar, and seal the entire complex beneath the earth around 8,000 BCE. as if they were trying to hide not just a building, but the very memory of what humanity had once been capable of achieving. The pillars themselves stand like silent witnesses to a story we've forgotten how to read, each one carved with intricate reliefs of animals that seem to dance and prowl across. The limestone surfaces, lions with bared fangs, foxes mid-leap, serpents coiling with almost hypnotic precision, wild boar charging with tusks forward, and vultures, always vultures, depicted with such frequency and prominence that they clearly held significance beyond mere artistic preference. These aren't the crude stick figures or simple handprints we associate with primitive art from this period. These are sophisticated, anatomically accurate, stylistically consistent representations that required not just artistic skill, but a developed symbolic language, a shared cultural mythology, and the kind of specialized labor force that supposedly couldn't exist until humans settled down, developed agriculture, created surplus food production, and built the complex social hierarchies necessary to support non-food-producing artisan classes. Except, here we have irrefutable evidence that the artisans came first, that the temple complex predated the agricultural revolution, that humans built monumental sacred architecture before they built permanent houses, before they planted the first domesticated wheat, before they did any of the things we've insisted must come before monumental construction projects could even be contemplated. The archaeological establishment has tied itself in intellectual knots, trying to reconcile this sequence of events with the established narrative of human development, proposing that perhaps the desire to build sacred spaces actually drove the agricultural revolution, rather than the other way around. That maybe 12,000 years ago, scattered hunter-gatherer bands were so motivated by religious fervor or spiritual yearning that they came together seasonally to quarry and erect these megalithic structures, then wandered back to their nomadic existence until the next building season. Which, frankly, raises even more questions than it answers, because it suggests a level of coordination, planning, and shared purpose across vast distances and different tribal groups that makes modern United Nations summits look functional by comparison. But the real mystery, the detail that should make us profoundly uncomfortable with our neat categories and confident timelines, lies not in what the carvings depict, but in what they might be documenting. Because interspersed among the animal reliefs are stranger images that don't fit the simple fertility cult or shamanistic ritual site explanations that academics grasp at when confronted with the inexplicable. There are anthropomorphic figures, human-like but distinctly other, some without heads, others with features that seem deliberately abstracted or obscured. And there are geometric patterns that align with astronomical configurations, suggesting whoever built this place understood celestial mechanics with a precision that supposedly wouldn't be achieved until the development of mathematics thousands of years later. And then there's Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, which has become the focus of intense scrutiny and increasingly uncomfortable speculation, because it appears to depict a specific astronomical configuration, the position of certain constellations at a particular moment in time. And when researchers attempted to date this stellar arrangement, they arrived at approximately 10,950 BCE, which corresponds almost exactly with the beginning of the Younger Dryas impact event, a period of dramatic climate catastrophe when Earth's temperature plummeted by 15 degrees Celsius within a decade, when massive amounts of ice melted and reformed, when sea levels fluctuated wildly, when dozens of megafauna species went abruptly extinct, and when, according to over 250 independent cultural traditions worldwide, a great flood destroyed the world that existed before our own. The Younger Dryas isn't mythology, it's geological fact, recorded in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment layers across North America, in the sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture, in the extinction of woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats, all within a geological eye blink. And increasingly, scientists are accepting that this climate catastrophe was triggered not by gradual processes, but by one or more massive cosmic impacts, comets or asteroids that struck Earth with such force that they vaporized ice sheets, triggered continental wildfires, and threw enough debris into the atmosphere to darken the skies and plunge the planet into a prolonged winter that nearly extinguished humanity along with the megafauna. We know from genetic analysis that human populations crashed during this period, that we passed through what's called a genetic bottleneck, suggesting our ancestors were reduced to perhaps a few thousand breeding pairs worldwide, scattered refugees clinging to survival in whatever pockets of habitability remained on a planet that had suddenly become hostile to complex life. And yet, somehow, the immediate aftermath of this apocalypse, someone not only survived, but possessed the knowledge, organization, and sheer determination to begin constructing Göbekli Tepe, as if building this monument was more important than finding food, more urgent than establishing permanent shelter, more critical to their survival than any of the practical necessities that should have consumed every moment of their existence. Unless, of course, they weren't starting from scratch, but preserving something, memorializing something, or perhaps warning future generations about something they had witnessed, something so catastrophic and so important that they needed to encode it in stone, because they understood that everything else, their cities, their writings, their entire civilization, if such existed, would be swept away by the cataclysm, leaving only these megaliths as testament to what had come before and what had been lost. This is where the orthodox archaeological narrative begins to crack under the weight of its own contradictions, where we have to start entertaining possibilities that make comfortable academics deeply uncomfortable. Because if Göbekli Tepe is a memorial rather than a temple, if it's a warning rather than a worship site, then we have to ask what it's memorializing and who had the knowledge to encode astronomical events and complex symbolic language in stone at a time when humans supposedly hadn't progressed beyond following game herds and gathering seasonal plants. Enter the Anunnaki, those mysterious beings described in Sumerian texts as those who from heaven to earth came. The entities credited with teaching humanity agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and the arts of civilization. The gods who walked among our ancestors and, according to the oldest written records humanity possesses, engaged in conflicts and wars that reshaped the face of the earth and nearly destroyed the humans they had created or cultivated. Modern scholarship dismisses these texts as mythology, colorful stories invented by primitive minds trying to explain natural phenomena they couldn't understand. But that dismissal becomes harder to maintain when you're standing at Göbekli Tepe, looking at precisely carved pillars that shouldn't exist, arranged according to astronomical principles that supposedly hadn't been discovered yet, built by people who supposedly lacked the organizational capacity to build anything more complex than windbreaks and temporary shelters, all constructed in the immediate aftermath of a genuine planetary catastrophe that the texts describe with surprising accuracy, referring to fire from the sky, great floods, the destruction of cities, and the near extinction of humanity. What if we've been reading the evidence backward, interpreting advanced knowledge as primitive superstition, simply because it doesn't fit our preferred narrative of steady, gradual progress from simple to complex, from ignorant to enlightened, from primitive to civilized? What if Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of something, but the end? Not humanity's first tentative steps towards civilization, but the last desperate act of survivors trying to preserve knowledge from a civilization that had already reached heights we can barely imagine, and then destroyed itself in a conflagration so complete that it reset human development by thousands of years, leaving only fragments, only whispers, only these massive stone monuments standing like tombstones over a world we don't remember losing. The implications are staggering and deeply unsettling, because if there was indeed an advanced civilization before ours, if beings we've relegated to mythology were real entities with real technology, if the war described in ancient texts actually happened and left Göbekli Tepe as its memorial, then we're not the first time humanity has climbed this ladder, not the first to develop sophisticated technology, not the first to reach for the stars. And most disturbingly, we might not be the first to face the choice between wisdom and destruction, between using our capabilities to elevate existence or using them to wage war so devastating that it erases civilizations from history and reduces survivors to scattered, traumatized refugees who bury the evidence of what they once were, because the memory is too painful or too dangerous to preserve. The farmer who kicked that stone in 1994 didn't just discover an archaeological site. He kicked open a door to questions that archaeology alone cannot answer. Questions that require us to reconsider ancient texts we've dismissed as fantasy, to re-examine mythologies we've categorized as primitive, and to entertain the possibility that the Anunnaki described in Sumerian tablets weren't invented gods, but remembered beings. Entities who walked among our ancestors, shaped early civilizations, and then fought a war so catastrophic that it broke the sky, drowned the world, and forced humanity to begin again from almost nothing, carrying only fragments of the knowledge that had come before, fragments encoded in myths, in monuments, and in massive stone circles that still stand in the Turkish highlands, waiting for us to finally understand what they're trying to tell us about where we came from, what we survived, and what we might be doomed to repeat if we don't learn to read the warning carved into pillars that have been standing longer than civilization itself. And those warnings, those cryptic symbols and astronomical alignments and headless figures carved into limestone 12,000 years ago, they point toward a story far stranger and more disturbing than anything we've allowed ourselves to consider. A story about gods who weren't gods. about a war that nearly ended everything, and about survivors who buried the evidence not to hide their achievement, but to hide their shame, their horror, their desperate hope that future humans would never again reach the level of advancement that led to such devastating consequences. Which brings us to the question that should keep us awake at night as we stand on the threshold of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and technologies that would seem godlike to our ancestors. If the Anunnaki were real, if they fought a final war that destroyed their civilization and nearly extinguished ours, then who exactly were these beings? Where did they come from? And what could possibly have driven them to wage a conflict so catastrophic that its echoes still reverberate through every flood myth, every tale of fallen gods, every warning about hubris and towers reaching toward heaven that humanity has preserved across 12,000 years of oral tradition and written history? Every civilization on Earth, separated by oceans they couldn't cross and millennia they couldn't bridge, tells fundamentally the same story, with such consistent details that dismissing it as coincidence requires more faith than accepting it as fractured memory. And that story goes like this. Beings came from the sky. Beings who possessed knowledge and power far beyond anything humans could comprehend. Beings who taught our ancestors agriculture and astronomy and architecture and writing and mathematics. Beings who shaped early humans either through direct genetic intervention or through cultural transmission so profound it might as well have been biological. And then these beings, these gods or angels or sky people or whatever name each culture assigned them, turned on each other in a war so devastating that it shattered the world, killed most of humanity, and left the survivors so traumatized that they spent the next several thousand years trying to forget and remember simultaneously, encoding the truth in myths that would preserve the warning while obscuring the specifics, because the specifics were apparently too terrible to face directly. The academic establishment treats this near-universal narrative pattern as evidence of nothing more than humanity's tendency toward myth-making, our psychological need to attribute unexplained phenomena to supernatural causes, our childlike desire to imagine that powerful beings once cared about our fate and intervened in our development. But that dismissal becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when you actually read the source texts, the original accounts from Sumerian cuneiform tablets that predate the Bible by millennia, and discover that these aren't vague, poetic allegories or obvious metaphors for natural forces. They're surprisingly specific, almost technical descriptions of events and entities and technologies that read less like mythology and more like historical accounts, written by people trying to describe advanced science with a vocabulary that didn't include words for genetics, aerospace engineering, or nuclear physics. The Sumerian tablets, particularly those detailing the Anunnaki, describe these beings with a precision that should make us profoundly uncomfortable, explaining that they came from a planet called Nibiru, that they initially came to Earth seeking gold for purposes related to their own planetary atmosphere, that they found early humans or hominids already present and genetically modified them to create workers capable of mining and agriculture, effectively uplifting humanity from whatever proto-human state we existed in to become the sapient, self-aware species we recognize as behaviorally modern humans. These texts don't describe mystical creation from clay and divine breath. They describe a process that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering, with the goddess Ninhursag, also called Ninmah, conducting what read like laboratory experiments, mixing the essence of the Anunnaki with that of existing Earth creatures to produce a hybrid being, us, capable of understanding language, following complex instructions, and performing sophisticated labor that pure hominids apparently couldn't manage. And the texts are explicit that this process took multiple attempts, producing failures and malformed creatures before arriving at the successful design, which is exactly what modern genetic engineering looks like. A process of trial and error and refinement until the desired outcome is achieved. But the really unsettling details emerge when these texts describe the Anunnaki themselves, their hierarchy, their politics, and their increasingly dysfunctional family dynamics. Because, according to these ancient accounts, the Anunnaki weren't a unified force of benevolent teachers descending to uplift primitive humanity out of pure altruism. They were fractured into competing factions, led primarily by two half-brothers, Enki and Enlil, whose rivalry and fundamentally opposed philosophies about humanity's role and rights would eventually escalate into the catastrophic war that Göbekli Tepe may have been built to memorialize. Enki, described as the chief scientist and genetic engineer among the Anunnaki, apparently viewed humans as more than mere workers, saw potential in the species he had helped create, and increasingly advocated for treating humanity as junior partners deserving of knowledge, autonomy, and respect. While Enlil, the chief administrator and military commander, viewed humans as exactly what they'd been designed to be: workers, servants, a created species that should remain subordinate to their creators and never be given knowledge or tools that might allow them to challenge Anunnaki supremacy. This philosophical divide reads like every political and ethical debate we have today about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and the rights of created beings, which either means the Sumerians had remarkably sophisticated philosophical insights that happened to predict our current technological and ethical dilemmas, or they were recording actual historical conflicts between factions of advanced beings who faced these questions before we did, and answered them with warfare rather than wisdom. The texts become even more specific when describing the mechanisms and artifacts of Anunnaki civilization, referring to flying machines called celestial boats or sky chambers that could traverse between Earth and the heavens, describing communication devices that allowed instant contact across vast distances, detailing weapons that could level mountains and poison the Earth for generations, and documenting genetic laboratories where new life forms were designed and tested, all described in Sumerian cuneiform written over 4,000 years ago by scribes who supposedly had no concept of flight, no understanding of genetics, no framework for imagining technologies that wouldn't be developed until the 20th century. Unless, of course, they weren't imagining, but recording. Weren't inventing, but preserving accounts of things they or their ancestors had actually witnessed. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which most people know only through sanitized adaptations that emphasize the hero's journey and the search for immortality, contains passages describing Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu encountering beings of terrible power who guarded cedar forests with weapons that emitted rays of light capable of killing from a distance, who wore garments that protected them from harm, who possessed knowledge of all things past and future. And when you read these descriptions alongside similar accounts from completely independent cultural traditions, the Hindu Vedas describing Vimanas, flying palaces equipped with weapons of devastating power, the Book of Enoch detailing the Watchers who descended from heaven and taught humans forbidden knowledge, the Mesoamerican accounts of Quetzalcoatl and other sky beings who brought civilization before departing in sorrow. You start to see not isolated mythology, but a global phenomenon being described from multiple perspectives, like different witnesses at an accident scene, giving consistent testimony despite variations in language, cultural context, and specific details. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these texts presents another layer of impossibility that conventional archaeology simply cannot explain away. Because the Sumerians possessed detailed information about our solar system that they supposedly couldn't have known, describing planets that wouldn't be discovered until the invention of modern telescopes, referring to the Earth as a sphere spinning through space at a time when humans allegedly believed the world was flat and stationary, and providing accurate calculations of planetary orbits, axial precession, and the cosmic distances that separate celestial bodies. Where did this knowledge come from, if not from beings who had actually traveled through space, who had observed these planets directly, who had developed the mathematics and instruments necessary to map the cosmos with precision? The standard explanation that ancient people were incredibly lucky guessers who stumbled upon accurate cosmic information through pure chance and primitive observation requires believing that Sumerian astronomers, equipped with nothing but naked eyes and reed calendars, somehow figured out details about distant planets that our civilization couldn't confirm until launching space probes in the 1970s. Which is roughly equivalent to believing that medieval alchemists accidentally invented quantum computing while trying to turn lead into gold. The conflict between Enki and Enlil, detailed across multiple Sumerian texts, including the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, escalated over millennia according to these accounts, with Enki repeatedly intervening to protect or preserve humanity against Enlil's attempts to cull or control the human population. And this conflict reached its catastrophic climax during the event Sumerian texts call the Great Deluge, which Enlil apparently either caused or allowed to proceed, having decided that humanity had become too numerous, too independent, and too knowledgeable to remain safely subordinate to Anunnaki authority. The texts explicitly state that Enlil forbade the other Anunnaki from warning humans about the coming catastrophe, intending to let the entire species drown and start over with a more controllable population. But Enki defied this decree, secretly warning a human named Ziusudra, who becomes Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions, and Noah in Hebrew tradition, about the coming flood and providing instructions for building a vessel that could survive the deluge, effectively committing treason against his own brother and his own species to preserve the humans he had helped create, which suggests either profound ethical conviction or deep emotional attachment to humanity as something more than mere created servants. What makes this account particularly chilling, when examined alongside geological evidence, is that the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the cosmic impact event and subsequent climate chaos that nearly extinguished human civilization around 10,800 BCE, aligns almost perfectly with the timeline and description of the flood event recorded in these texts. Which means either the Sumerians had access to geological records and ice core samples thousands of years before we developed the technology to extract such information, or they were preserving actual historical accounts transmitted through oral tradition for 6,000 years before being committed to cuneiform tablets. Accounts of witnessing a catastrophe so devastating that it killed off the megafauna, reshaped continents, and reduced human populations to scattered refugee groups clinging to survival in whatever highlands remained above the rapidly rising floodwaters. The texts describe the Anunnaki watching this catastrophe from orbit or from mountains, some weeping at humanity's destruction, others satisfied that the problem of human independence had been eliminated. And Enlil's rage when he discovered that Enki had saved Siasudra and his family, ensuring humanity's survival despite the deliberate attempt at species-level extermination. A rage that apparently led to further conflict among the Anunnaki themselves. Because preserving humanity against official decree represented not just disobedience, but fundamental schism within their ranks. The post-deluge texts describe a changed relationship between the Anunnaki and surviving humans, with the gods gradually withdrawing from direct governance, establishing human intermediaries as kings and priests, who would rule in their name rather than ruling directly themselves. And this transition corresponds eerily well with the archaeological evidence showing the sudden emergence of organized civilization in the Fertile Crescent, almost immediately after the Younger Dryas ended, as if someone had flipped a switch and humanity went from scattered hunter-gatherers to organized agricultural societies with writing, mathematics, centralized government, and monumental architecture within just a few centuries. Which is either the most remarkable coincidence in human history, or evidence that surviving Anunnaki or human students of Anunnaki knowledge were deliberately rebuilding civilization from fragments of what had existed before. The Sumerian king list, which modern scholars treat as a mix of mythology and history, becomes particularly interesting when examined through this lens, because it lists rulers who supposedly reigned for thousands of years before the flood, followed by much shorter-lived dynasties after the deluge, which could be literal truth if the pre-flood rulers were actually long-lived Anunnaki rather than humans, or could be a compressed historical record where individual Anunnaki names became attached to dynasties they established, rather than to their personal reign lengths. But either interpretation requires accepting that something fundamental about governance and longevity changed dramatically at exactly the point where geological evidence shows the planet experienced catastrophic trauma. The weapons described in these texts and in parallel accounts from other cultures deserve particular attention, because they're described with a consistency and specificity that becomes harder to dismiss as primitive imagination when you realize the descriptions match effects we now recognize from nuclear, chemical, and advanced energy weapons. The Mahabharata, the ancient Hindu epic, describes weapons called Brahmastra and Pasupatastra that created pillars of smoke and fire reaching to the heavens that made the earth tremble and mountains shake, that poisoned water and land for generations afterward, that caused hair and nails to fall out and unborn children to die in the womb. Symptoms that any modern reader recognizes immediately as radiation poisoning. And these weapons were wielded by beings who flew through the skies in vimanas, craft described with such technical precision that some modern engineers have attempted to build working models based on the specifications provided in texts like the Vaimanika Shastra, discovering that the designs, while exotic, follow coherent aerodynamic principles and could theoretically function if constructed with advanced materials. The Sumerian texts describe similar weapons, referring to the weapons of terror that Enlil and his sons wielded, describing cities destroyed in instants by lights brighter than the sun, lands left barren and poisoned where nothing would grow for generations, and refuges seeking shelter in mountains and caves from the ash and fire falling from the sky. And when you place these descriptions alongside archaeological anomalies like the vitrified stone fortifications in Scotland and India, glass-like formations that require temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Celsius to create, and appear in contexts where no natural explanation for such heat exists, or the radioactive skeletons discovered in Mohenjo-Daro that show radiation levels far above background, or the tektites scattered across the Middle East that indicate massive, high-temperature events, you're confronted with a pattern that either represents the most elaborate series of unrelated coincidences in archaeological history, or evidence of actual high-energy weapons being deployed in the ancient past. But perhaps the most disturbing parallel between ancient texts and modern reality lies not in the technologies described, but in the trajectory of conflict. Because, if we believe these accounts, the Anunnaki didn't arrive on Earth planning to wage war against each other. They came with what seemed like a straightforward mission to extract resources and created humanity as an expedient solution to their labor shortage. But then, over time, factions developed around different philosophies of how to treat created beings. Those factions hardened into intractable opposition. That opposition escalated through increasingly serious confrontations, and eventually the entire system collapsed into warfare that nearly destroyed both the Anunnaki civilization and the human civilization they had fostered. We're watching this same trajectory unfold today with artificial intelligence, with genetic engineering, with every technology that gives us godlike powers over life and consciousness. Watching factions form around questions of rights and autonomy and control. Watching philosophical differences harden into political opposition. Watching safeguards erode as competitive pressures override caution. And, if the Anunnaki texts are historical record, rather than mythological invention, then we're not pioneers facing unprecedented challenges, but students who failed to learn from the previous class, repeating a curriculum that ended in catastrophe the last time it was taught, approaching the same threshold that triggered the final war among beings who had technologies we're only now beginning to develop. Which raises the most important and most terrifying question. If they couldn't navigate these challenges successfully, despite being more advanced than we are, what makes us think we'll do any better? And what happens when we reach the level of technological sophistication that allows us to deploy the same weapons, conduct the same genetic experiments, and face the same ethical dilemmas that apparently destroyed the civilization that created us? The answer to that question may be encoded in Göbekli Tepe itself, in the deliberate burial that suggests survivors wanted to hide something, in the carvings that seem to document astronomical catastrophe, in the pillars that stand as memorial to something lost, and understanding what happened during the Anunnaki's final war, understanding the sequence of events that led from cosmic visitors with good intentions to global catastrophe that nearly extinguished all higher life on Earth, may be the most important historical investigation humanity has ever undertaken. Because we're not just trying to satisfy archaeological curiosity about who built what and when. We're trying to read a warning label written by previous users of technologies we're about to deploy, trying to learn from mistakes we don't remember making, trying to avoid becoming the next civilization that builds monuments to memorialize our own destruction and buries them in the desperate hope that whatever species comes after us will be smarter than we were. The Younger Dryas stands in geological history as one of Earth's most dramatic and least understood climatic reversals, a period spanning from approximately 10,800 BCE to 9,600 BCE, when the planet, which had been steadily warming after the last ice age and seemed well on its way toward the temperate climate that would eventually allow human civilization to flourish, suddenly and catastrophically reversed course, plunging back into glacial conditions so severe and so rapid that temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade, possibly within a single human lifetime, possibly even within a few years, transforming a world that was becoming increasingly hospitable to human habitation into a frozen nightmare, where ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly surged forward again, where sea levels that had been gradually rising instead fluctuated wildly as massive ice dams formed and catastrophically failed, releasing floods of such magnitude that they carved channels hundreds of feet deep through solid bedrock and deposited house-sized boulders hundreds of miles from their origin points. And where the megafauna that had survived hundreds of thousands of years of previous climate fluctuations, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, and dozens of other species, suddenly went extinct across multiple continents simultaneously, as if someone had flipped a switch and decided that the Pleistocene epoch needed to end immediately. And violently, rather than fading gradually into the Holocene as geological processes would normally dictate. The scientific consensus, arrived at only recently and still contested in some quarters because the implications are so disturbing, points toward a cosmic impact, or, more likely, a series of impacts from a fragmenting comet that struck the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America, vaporizing billions of tons of ice instantly, triggering continent-wide wildfires as superheated ejecta rained down across thousands of square miles, and throwing enough debris into the atmosphere to darken the skies and initiate a rapid cooling cycle that persisted for over a millennium. The evidence for this catastrophe appears in a thin layer of sediment found at the Younger Dryas boundary across North America, Europe, and Asia, containing high concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets, along with nanodiamonds that only form under the extreme pressures generated by cosmic impacts, along with a carbon-rich layer indicating massive biomass burning on a continental scale, along with what's called shocked quartz, a distinctive crystalline formation that only occurs when normal quartz is subjected to the incredible pressures of nuclear detonations or extraterrestrial impacts. And this evidence layer appears in geological contexts dated to within a few decades of 10,800 BCE, which corresponds almost exactly with the date encoded in Göbekli Tepe's Pillar 43. If researchers correctly interpret the stellar positions carved into that limestone monument as representing a specific moment in astronomical time. But here's where natural catastrophe intersects with the historical accounts preserved in ancient texts from cultures around the world. Because over 250 independent mythological traditions describe a period of cosmic warfare, of fire falling from the sky, of weapons wielded by gods that could destroy mountains and boil seas, of a deluge that covered the earth and drowned nearly all of humanity. And these accounts aren't vague, poetic references to storms or floods. They're surprisingly specific descriptions of phenomena that match both the geological evidence of the Younger Dryas impacts and the effects we would expect from advanced weaponry being deployed on a planetary scale. The Mahabharata, composed in Sanskrit and describing events that the text itself claims occurred in a previous age of the world, contains passages that have made modern scholars deeply uncomfortable ever since nuclear weapons were developed and people started recognizing the descriptions of Brahmastra and similar divine weapons as bearing uncanny resemblance to atomic explosions, with phrases describing a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, creating an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns that rose up in all its splendor, while below it earth trembled and water boiled and elephants burst into flame and warriors threw themselves into rivers trying to escape heat that penetrated armor and flesh alike, leaving those who survived with their hair and nails falling out, their skin covered in lesions, food becoming poisoned, and children being born malformed or dead. A catalogue of symptoms that any radiation oncologist would immediately recognize as describing acute radiation syndrome and its aftermath. The text goes further, describing how these weapons poisoned the land so thoroughly that nothing would grow there for years afterward, how water became undrinkable, how whole cities were reduced to ash in moments, and how the weapons themselves were so terrible that even the gods who wielded them expressed horror at what they had unleashed, with passages suggesting that some of these weapons were deliberately broken or hidden after the war, because their continued existence posed too great a danger to the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian and based on even older Sumerian sources, describes the flood that destroyed the world before the current age in terms that align disturbingly well with what we know about the Younger Dryas catastrophe. With Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Ziusudra, who survives the deluge, recounting how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how Ea, Enki in Sumerian, defied this decision and warned him to build a boat, how the deluge came with such violence that the gods themselves were frightened by the flood and withdrew to the heaven of Anu, how the destruction was so complete that the gods were cowering like dogs while the waters raged below them, and how, when the floods finally subsided and Utnapishtim's boat grounded on a mountain, the god Enlil was furious to discover that humans had survived, leading to conflict among the gods themselves about whether humanity should have been preserved. The Atrahasis, another Akkadian text drawing from Sumerian sources, provides even more explicit detail about the conflict leading up to the flood, describing how humanity had multiplied to the point where Enlil found their noise and independence intolerable. How he first attempted to reduce the human population through plague and famine, and when those proved insufficient because Enki kept intervening to help humans survive, Enlil finally decided to use the coming deluge as an opportunity to eliminate the human problem entirely, by forbidding the other Anunnaki from warning any humans about what was coming, essentially weaponizing a natural catastrophe, or possibly causing the catastrophe itself through means the text doesn't make entirely clear, but describes as being within the god's power to prevent or unleash. The critical detail that should make us reconsider these texts as historical accounts rather than pure mythology is that they describe a sequence of events: overpopulation leading to resource stress, leading to attempted population control, leading to factional conflict among the gods, leading to catastrophic warfare or weaponized catastrophe, that matches the trajectory we see in every civilization that develops beyond its resource base and splits into competing factions over how to address the resulting crisis, suggesting either that these texts preserve genuine historical memory of such a conflict occurring among technologically advanced beings who preceded our current civilization, or that humans across multiple independent cultures all independently invented the exact same cautionary tale about technological hubris and factional warfare leading to species-threatening catastrophe, which seems less likely than the possibility that we're all remembering the same actual events through different cultural lenses. The Chinese have their flood myths centered on Gun-Yu. The Japanese have Amaterasu, withdrawing from the world in sorrow over warfare among the kami. The Norse describe Ragnarok with its Fimbulwinter and the breaking of bonds that hold chaos at bay. The Maya speak of worlds destroyed by flood and fire before the current creation. The Hopi describe emergence from previous worlds that were destroyed when humans became too corrupt or too knowledgeable. And when you compile these accounts and strip away the cultural specific details, you're left with a consistent core narrative. There was a previous age of advanced civilization. Beings of great power walked the earth or descended from the sky. Those beings came into conflict with each other. That conflict escalated to the deployment of devastating weapons. Those weapons, or the natural catastrophes they triggered, nearly extinguished humanity. A small number of humans survived through divine intervention or luck or foreknowledge, and those survivors carried fragments of previous knowledge forward to slowly rebuild civilization from the ashes of what had been destroyed, knowing that they would never fully recover what had been lost, but hoping that future generations might at least learn enough from the catastrophe to avoid repeating it. The archaeological evidence of destruction during this period goes beyond the impact markers in the Younger Dryas boundary layer, extending to anomalies that conventional geology struggles to explain, and that become much more comprehensible if we entertain the possibility that advanced weapons were deployed during this time frame. Vitrified stone fortifications, where rock has been heated to temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Celsius and transformed into a glass-like substance, appear at sites across Scotland, Turkey, Iran, and India. And while various explanations have been proposed, intense fires, lightning strikes, volcanic activity, none adequately explain why these vitrified sections appear specifically at defensive structures, why they occur in patterns suggesting directed energy rather than random exposure to heat, or how primitive peoples supposedly armed with nothing but bronze or stone weapons could generate and sustain the temperatures necessary to vitrify rock on this scale. even if they wanted to for some inexplicable reason. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, dated to approximately 2500 BCE, but possibly built on earlier foundations, contain radioactive skeletons showing radiation levels significantly above background, scattered in positions suggesting sudden death. Some still holding hands as if they died together, trying to flee something. And while natural radiation from thorium-rich soil has been proposed as an explanation, the distribution pattern and concentration levels match what we would expect from a tactical nuclear detonation, far better than they match natural radiation exposure over millennia. Tektites. Glassy objects formed when terrestrial material is subjected to the extreme heat and pressure of either cosmic impact or nuclear explosion, and then launched into the atmosphere before falling back to Earth, are scattered across the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and North America in patterns and quantities that exceed what the known impact events from the Younger Dryas would predict, suggesting either additional impacts that left no craters, perhaps airbursts like the Tunguska event, but far more numerous, or artificial creation through weapons deployment, and some of these tektites contain isotopic signatures that don't match the expected composition from natural impact processes, containing trace elements that suggest they formed from more diverse source materials than a single impact event would produce. The Libyan desert glass, a yellow-green tektite material scattered across 6,000 square kilometers of Egyptian desert, is so pure and so uniformly distributed that attempts to recreate it through simulated impact experiments have failed, with researchers unable to match the temperature distribution, cooling rate, and purity levels without invoking temperatures and pressures beyond what natural impact events typically generate, leading some to propose that this glass field represents evidence of ancient nuclear testing or warfare, though such proposals are typically relegated to fringe publications because mainstream archaeology has no framework for incorporating such possibilities into its models of human development. The text of Atrahasis describes the aftermath of the deluge in terms that should give us pause, explaining that, when the waters receded and the surviving gods descended to assess the damage, they found the landscape transformed. Cities buried or destroyed, irrigation systems shattered, agricultural lands poisoned or buried under sediment, and the few surviving humans reduced to scattered refugees with no memory of how to maintain the complex technologies and social systems that had existed before the catastrophe, forcing the gods to essentially rebuild human civilization from scratch, teaching agriculture and writing and mathematics and astronomy all over again to people who had once known these things, but had lost the knowledge in the chaos of survival during the catastrophic period. This matches precisely what archaeological evidence shows happening in the Fertile Crescent in the centuries following the Younger Dryas, with agriculture appearing suddenly around 9500 BCE in the same region where Göbekli Tepe was being constructed, with domesticated wheat and barley varieties appearing essentially fully formed, rather than showing the gradual selection pressures we would expect from slow development, with irrigation techniques and settlement patterns appearing with sophistication that suggests prior knowledge being applied, rather than techniques being invented from nothing, and with religious and astronomical systems that seem to reference earlier traditions, rather than being wholly original creations. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE takes on new significance in this context, because if the site was constructed immediately after the Younger Dryas catastrophe by survivors or by remaining Anunnaki, working with human refugees. And if it was intended as a memorial to what had been lost, or a warning about what had been unleashed, then its burial, a millennium and a half later, suggests either that the warning had become too dangerous to leave exposed, or that the memory had become too painful to preserve in visible form. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, that whoever buried it wanted to ensure that future humans would have to work to uncover it, would have to develop sophisticated archaeology and carbon dating and astronomical analysis before they could access and understand the information encoded in its pillars, essentially creating a time lock that would only open when humanity had reached a certain level of technological sophistication. The same level, perhaps, that had existed before the catastrophe, ensuring that the warning would only be discovered by a civilization capable of understanding why the warning was necessary, because they were approaching the same threshold of dangerous capability that had triggered the previous disaster. The war that broke the sky, if we take the ancient texts as historical accounts, wasn't a brief conflict or a single catastrophic event, but rather a cascading series of escalations spanning possibly decades or centuries, with Enlil's faction attempting to control or reduce human populations, Enki's faction resisting and protecting humanity, humans themselves being drawn into the conflict as soldiers or victims or witnesses, weapons of increasing destructiveness being deployed as each side escalated in response to the other's provocations, until finally, someone deployed or triggered something so catastrophic that it destroyed the playing field itself, triggering the cosmic impacts or weaponized catastrophes that initiated the Younger Dryas, flooding the coastal cities where most advanced civilization had developed, destroying the agricultural systems that supported large populations, and reducing both Anunnaki civilization and human civilization to remnants, desperately trying to preserve whatever knowledge could be saved from the general collapse, knowing that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and unleashed forces that had nearly destroyed not just their civilizations, but the planetary biosphere itself. Forces that are described in the texts with such consistent horror across so many cultures that dismissing all of them as purely imaginative fiction requires a willful blindness to pattern recognition and a faith in coincidence that borders on religious conviction. And the truly terrifying aspect of this historical scenario, if we accept even partial validity to the ancient accounts, is that we appear to be following the exact same trajectory, developing technologies that give us godlike powers over life and death, splitting into factions with fundamentally opposed philosophies about how those technologies should be governed and who should benefit from them, escalating conflicts through increasingly sophisticated weapons, while telling ourselves that deterrence will prevent actual deployment, pursuing genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and energy weapons, while assuring ourselves that we're more responsible than previous generations, more wise than those who came before, certainly smarter than primitive god kings who supposedly couldn't control their own creations and ended up destroying their own civilizations in fratricidal warfare over questions of autonomy and control, and the rights of created beings to determine their own futures. Except that those primitive god kings might have been far more advanced than we are, might have faced exactly the dilemmas we're facing now, might have told themselves the same reassuring lies about safeguards and responsibility and controlled deployment, and might have discovered, too late to prevent catastrophe, that some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Some weapons once created will eventually be used, regardless of intentions or safeguards. And some conflicts, rooted in fundamental philosophical differences about power and autonomy and the nature of consciousness, cannot be resolved through negotiation or deterrence, but will inevitably escalate until someone decides that destroying everything is preferable to allowing the other side to win. Which is when the sky breaks and the world burns, and the survivors are left to bury the evidence and hope that whatever comes after will be wiser than what came before, while knowing, deep down, that wisdom is rarely inherited, and each generation seems destined to learn the same terrible lessons through the same terrible mistakes. Which is perhaps why the survivors buried Göbekli Tepe rather than destroying it completely, because they understood that the warning needed to be preserved, but that it needed to be hidden until humanity was ready to receive it. Which raises the question of whether we're ready now, whether we're capable of reading the message carved in those 12,000-year-old pillars and changing course before we repeat the catastrophe, or whether we're simply doomed to become the next civilization that builds monuments to our own hubris and buries them for whoever comes after, assuming anyone or anything does. Around 8000 BCE, approximately 1500 years after Göbekli Tepe was constructed with such tremendous effort and astronomical precision, someone, or some group, made a decision that resonates with profound implications across the millennia that separate us from that moment. A decision that required mobilizing substantial labor forces, organizing the transport of thousands upon thousands of tons of rubble and sediment, and executing a plan so thorough and deliberate that it succeeded in hiding the entire complex for 10,000 years. They buried it, completely and intentionally, filling every chamber with debris, covering every pillar with carefully deposited fill material, sealing the entire site beneath an artificial hill that would eventually be reclaimed by vegetation and erosion, until nothing visible remained to suggest that beneath the unremarkable Turkish hilltop lay the most sophisticated construction project of its era, a monument that had stood as testament to knowledge and capability that supposedly wouldn't exist for another 6 millennia. This wasn't abandonment, which would have left the structure exposed to gradual decay and environmental degradation. This wasn't destruction, which would have toppled the pillars and shattered the carvings. This was preservation through concealment, the deliberate choice to hide rather than destroy, to bury rather than erase, suggesting that whoever made this decision believed the site held value or information worth preserving, but also believed that it needed to be hidden, needed to be made inaccessible, needed to be removed from human awareness. For reasons we can only infer from the archaeological evidence and the broader context of what the ancient texts tell us about the post-catastrophe world and the psychological state of survivors who had witnessed the near extinction of their species. The scale of the burial operation cannot be overstated, because we're not talking about a structure gradually being covered by natural sediment accumulation over centuries or millennia. The geological analysis makes clear that the fill material was deliberately imported, carefully deposited, and systematically compacted to ensure complete coverage, representing a construction project in reverse, an anti-monument that required organizational capacity and sustained labor input comparable to the original construction, which raises the immediate question of why any society would invest such tremendous resources in hiding something rather than simply walking away and letting time and weather do the work of concealment. You don't bury something this thoroughly unless you're trying to ensure it stays hidden, unless you're protecting it from something, or protecting something from it. Unless the very existence of this place in accessible form represents a danger, or a temptation, or a memory too painful or too dangerous to allow to persist in visible form, where future generations might encounter it, be influenced by it, or attempt to replicate what it represented. The timing of the burial coincides with the emergence of what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic B period in the Fertile Crescent, a time when agricultural communities were becoming established, when domesticated plants and animals were spreading throughout the region, when permanent settlements were replacing the mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and when, according to the standard narrative of human development, humanity was supposedly making its first tentative steps towards civilization after millennia of primitive subsistence living. Yet, burial of Göbekli Tepe suggests something quite different. Not a civilization being born, but a civilization deliberately choosing to forget. Not humanity ascending toward complexity, but humanity retreating from it. Not the beginning of monumental construction, but the deliberate concealment of monumental construction that already existed. As if the survivors of whatever catastrophe had devastated the previous era had collectively decided that certain capabilities, certain knowledge, certain expressions of human or transhuman achievement needed to be removed from circulation, hidden away where they couldn't inspire or tempt future generations to pursue the same paths that had led to catastrophe. The ancient texts, particularly those describing the post-deluge period, speak repeatedly of knowledge being concealed or forbidden, of technologies being deliberately abandoned, of the gods or surviving advanced beings imposing restrictions on what humans were allowed to know or develop. And these accounts, which mainstream scholarship treats as mythological explanations for why ancient people lacked certain capabilities, take on a very different character if we consider the possibility that they're describing actual historical policies implemented by survivors who had witnessed advanced civilization destroying itself through misuse of its own capabilities. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon but preserved in Ethiopian Christian tradition and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the Watchers, divine beings who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, being punished and bound specifically because they had given humanity access to technologies and information that we weren't ready to handle responsibly, with specific mention of teaching metallurgy, weapon-making, cosmetics, sorcery, which might be primitive terminology for chemistry or pharmacology, and astronomy. And the text makes clear that these weren't gifts, but violations, that there were apparently rules about what humans should and shouldn't know, rules that some beings chose to violate out of affection for humanity, or factional conflict with those who wanted to keep humans ignorant. And the result of these violations, according to the text, was violence, warfare, and corruption that ultimately necessitated the flood to cleanse the earth of what had been unleashed. The Genesis account, which most people know through religious teaching that emphasizes sin and disobedience, contains similar themes when read as potential historical allegory rather than purely theological doctrine. The eating of fruit from the tree of knowledge represents humanity gaining access to information that divine beings wanted to restrict. The expulsion from Eden represents the end of a period when advanced beings directly provided for human needs. And the Tower of Babel narrative describes humanity attempting to build a structure that would reach unto heaven, presumably some kind of advanced technology or space-capable construction, which the divine beings deliberately sabotage by confusing the languages and scattering humanity across the earth, fragmenting the knowledge base and preventing the kind of large-scale coordination necessary for major technological projects. Read literally. These stories make God seem capricious and punitive. Read as allegorical accounts of advanced beings deliberately restricting human technological development after witnessing what happens when species gain capabilities before developing the wisdom to use them responsibly. These stories become historical accounts of post-catastrophe survivors implementing safeguards to prevent repetition of whatever disaster had nearly destroyed everyone. The genetic evidence from human populations shows something fascinating and disturbing that aligns with both the burial of Göbekli Tepe and the textual accounts of deliberate knowledge suppression. Humanity passed through what geneticists call a population bottleneck around 10,000 BCE, meaning our total global population crashed to perhaps as few as several thousand breeding pairs. And when populations crash that severely, you lose more than numbers. You lose accumulated knowledge, specialized skills, technological capabilities, because complex civilizations depend on large populations to support the specialists and infrastructure necessary for maintaining advanced systems. And when you suddenly have only a few thousand survivors scattered across a devastated landscape, those survivors are focused entirely on immediate subsistence, on gathering food and finding shelter and protecting their children, not on maintaining astronomical observatories or preserving metallurgical techniques or keeping geometric and mathematical knowledge alive for future generations. The amnesia that appears in the archaeological record after the Younger Dryas, the sudden collapse of whatever sophisticated capabilities had allowed the construction of Göbekli Tepe, might not represent natural loss through population reduction, but deliberate suppression by survivors who had decided, individually or collectively, that certain knowledge needed to die with them, that future humans would be safer if they had to rediscover agriculture and mathematics and astronomy gradually, rather than inheriting the full technological package that had apparently enabled the previous generation to nearly destroy the world. The pattern we see emerging in the archaeological record of the Neolithic period, with agricultural knowledge and settled communities spreading gradually across the Fertile Crescent, and then to Europe and Asia over several thousand years, looks less like innovation and more like controlled dispersal when examined through this lens. As if someone was deliberately teaching humans how to farm and build permanent structures and domesticate animals, but carefully controlling the pace and scope of technological development, ensuring that each generation only received the knowledge it could safely handle, preventing the kind of rapid technological acceleration that had apparently characterized the pre-catastrophe civilization and led to its self-destruction. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this scenario, with the Anunnaki establishing the first post-flood cities, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and installing human rulers who were taught specific skills and given specific responsibilities, but were also kept deliberately ignorant of the full scope of knowledge that the Anunnaki possessed, with kingship and priesthood being presented as gifts from the gods, but also as mechanisms of control. Ways of organizing human societies through hierarchies where knowledge flowed downward from divine sources, rather than being freely discovered or shared horizontally among humans themselves. The concept of the Watchers, or Guardians, appears in multiple cultural traditions, describing beings whose role was specifically to observe humanity and intervene if we approached dangerous thresholds of capability. And while modern scholarship interprets these as mythological personifications of conscience or divine providence, they might equally represent actual entities or human groups tasked with monitoring human technological development and suppressing or redirecting efforts that threatened to recreate the conditions that had led to previous catastrophe. The mystery schools of Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia, which preserved esoteric knowledge in secrecy and only revealed it to carefully vetted initiates through stages of increasing revelation, might represent institutional expressions of this policy of controlled knowledge dissemination, ensuring that powerful information about mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and natural philosophy was only given to individuals who had demonstrated sufficient wisdom and restraint to use it responsibly, with the most dangerous knowledge being kept in the innermost circles, revealed only to those who had spent decades proving their worthiness, and even then only transmitted orally or through symbolic language that couldn't be accessed by the uninitiated. The burial of Göbekli Tepe fits perfectly into this pattern of deliberate amnesia and controlled knowledge suppression, because the site itself represented physical proof of capabilities that the post-catastrophe world had decided humans shouldn't possess, standing as a monument that would constantly remind people of what their ancestors had been able to achieve, and potentially inspiring attempts to recover or recreate those capabilities before society had developed the ethical and philosophical frameworks necessary to prevent those capabilities from being misused, as they apparently had been before. By burying the site completely, the decision-makers ensured that future generations would have no easy access to this reminder, no physical template to inspire technological ambition, no proof that monumental construction had been possible thousands of years before the pyramids and ziggurats that would eventually be built. And the thoroughness of the burial suggests they were trying to remove it from cultural memory entirely, to ensure that even stories about the place would fade and be forgotten over generations, until Göbekli Tepe existed only as myth, if it was remembered at all, safely relegated to the realm of fantasy, where it couldn't inspire actual attempts at reconstruction or technological recovery. The psychological impact of surviving a near-extinction event cannot be underestimated when trying to understand why survivors would choose to bury rather than preserve, to forget rather than remember, to deliberately reduce their own capabilities and ensure their children would never achieve what they themselves had achieved. Because witnessing the collapse of civilization, watching advanced technology being turned toward destruction, seeing cities destroyed, populations decimated, surviving the environmental catastrophe triggered by weapons or cosmic impacts, or whatever combination of factors actually caused the Younger Dryas. That kind of trauma doesn't just affect individuals, it reshapes entire societies, creates collective determination to ensure that whatever happened never happens again. And if the survivors believed, rightly or wrongly, that advanced technology and concentrated knowledge had been prerequisites for the catastrophe, then the logical response would be to deliberately dismantle that technology and disperse that knowledge, to create a world where future generations would be protected from their own potential for self-destruction by being kept in a state of managed ignorance, given enough knowledge to survive and build comfortable lives, but not enough to pose existential threats to themselves or the planetary ecosystem. The irony, of course, is that this strategy of deliberate amnesia and controlled knowledge suppression could only ever be temporary, because human curiosity and ingenuity cannot be permanently suppressed. We're a species that discovers, that invents, that pushes boundaries, and any attempt to keep us ignorant will eventually fail as we independently rediscover what our ancestors knew, or discover entirely new paths to similar capabilities. Which means that burial of Göbekli Tepe and the suppression of pre-catastrophe knowledge might have bought civilization several thousand years of relative safety, several thousand years for ethical and philosophical development to occur before technological capability accelerated again. But it couldn't prevent us from eventually reaching the same threshold, developing the same dangerous capabilities, facing the same choices about how to use power that exceeds our wisdom to control it. The survivors who buried Göbekli Tepe might have understood this, might have known that their efforts at suppression were only temporary measures, might have chosen burial rather than destruction, specifically because they wanted the information preserved for the moment when humanity would inevitably rediscover these capabilities and would need to understand what happened last time, would need access to the warning encoded in those megalithic pillars, would need to see the astronomical documentation of the catastrophe and the symbolic representations of the war that had broken the sky and nearly extinguished all higher life. Which brings us to the present moment, to our current civilization that has developed nuclear weapons and genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, and is rapidly approaching the level of capability that the pre-catastrophe civilization apparently possessed, and to the fact that Göbekli Tepe remained hidden, completely hidden, for 10,000 years, and only emerged into human awareness in 1994, which is either remarkable coincidence or suggests that the time lock worked exactly as intended, that the site remained inaccessible until we had developed archaeology sophisticated enough to recognize what we were looking at, carbon dating precise enough to establish the timeline, astronomical analysis capable enough to decode the stellar alignments, and, perhaps most importantly, until we had developed enough of our own dangerous technologies to understand why the warning was necessary, to recognize that the trajectory we're following matches the trajectory that led to previous catastrophe, to see ourselves reflected in the ancient accounts of beings who possessed great power but lacked the wisdom to prevent that power from being turned toward destruction in factional conflicts over control and autonomy, and the rights of created beings to determine their own destinies. The burial of Göbekli Tepe wasn't an ending, but a pause. Not erasure, but encryption. Not destruction of the warning, but protection of it, until the warning could be understood and heeded by a civilization that had reached a point where heeding it might make the difference between survival and repetition of the catastrophe that nearly ended everything 12,000 years ago. And the fact that we're now excavating the site, decoding its messages, connecting its timeline to the Younger Dryas catastrophe. And reading the ancient texts with new understanding of what they might actually be describing suggests that we've reached that point, that we're standing at the threshold where the warning becomes immediately relevant, because we're approaching the same capabilities that triggered the war that broke the sky. And the question now is whether we're capable of learning from what happened before, whether we can recognize the pattern and choose differently, or whether we're simply doomed to repeat the cycle, to build our own monuments to hubris and then bury them in the desperate hope that whatever comes after us will be wiser than we were, continuing the endless cycle of civilization rising to dangerous heights, destroying itself, and leaving only buried warnings for the next iteration to discover too late or ignore completely. Which is why the next chapter of this investigation must examine what those warnings actually say, what specific lessons the survivors encoded in stone and text and myth. Because if we can't or won't learn from the Anunnaki's final war and the catastrophe it unleashed, then we're not just in danger of repeating their mistakes, we're guaranteed to. Because the trajectory is identical. The capabilities are converging toward the same threshold, and human nature hasn't fundamentally changed in 12,000 years. Which means that without conscious intervention and deliberate choice to act differently than our predecessors, we'll make the same choices, deploy the same weapons, trigger the same catastrophes, and leave the same buried warnings for whatever species or civilization comes after us to excavate and hopefully, finally, learn from before it's too late for them as well. Göbekli Tepe sits in southeastern Turkey today, still approximately 95% unexcavated beneath the earth that was deliberately piled upon it 10,000 years ago. And the archaeologists who have access to ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies report with barely concealed trepidation that what remains buried appears to be even older, even larger, and even more structurally complex than what has already been revealed, suggesting that the portions of the site we've uncovered represent perhaps the final phase of construction, or the most recent modifications before burial, and that beneath the known enclosures lie earlier structures, deeper secrets, and potentially more explicit documentation of whatever events these megalithic monuments were built to commemorate or warn against. The reluctance to excavate more rapidly, which might seem like excessive caution or bureaucratic inertia to casual observers eager for revelation, actually represents profound wisdom on the part of the Turkish government and the international archaeological community, because they've recognized, perhaps unconsciously but nonetheless accurately, that this site contains information we might not be ready to process. Evidence that could fundamentally destabilize our understanding of human history and our place in the cosmic timeline. And rushing to uncover everything before we've properly contextualized and understood what we've already found would be catastrophically irresponsible. Like a child discovering their parents' weapons cabinet and playing with loaded firearms without understanding what they're holding or what consequences might follow from careless handling. The timing of Göbekli Tepe's discovery in 1994, coming as it did during the acceleration of technological development that has characterized the past 3 decades, cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. When we consider the broader pattern of how knowledge seems to emerge precisely when humanity reaches the developmental stage where that knowledge becomes relevant or necessary. And we're now living through a period of technological advancement so rapid and so profound that it makes the entire previous history of human civilization look like prologue. With artificial intelligence systems achieving capabilities that were considered impossible just years ago. With genetic engineering technologies like CRISPR allowing us to rewrite the fundamental code of life with the same ease that previous generations edited text documents. With quantum computing threatening to break every encryption system that protects our digital infrastructure. With autonomous weapons systems removing humans from targeting decisions. With space colonization shifting from science fiction to engineering challenge. And with all of these capabilities accelerating simultaneously, converging toward a threshold where we're not just developing powerful technologies, but developing technologies that can autonomously develop even more powerful technologies, creating the kind of recursive acceleration that every cautionary tale about artificial intelligence or genetic engineering or advanced weapons has warned against, but that we seem powerless or unwilling to slow down. Because competitive pressures between nations and corporations make restraint feel like weakness. And because we've convinced ourselves that we're somehow wiser, more responsible, more capable of managing these capabilities than any previous generation, despite mounting evidence that we're just as tribal, just as prone to factional conflict, just as willing to pursue short-term advantage at the cost of long-term stability as every human society that has ever existed. The parallels between our current trajectory and what the ancient texts describe about the Anunnaki civilization become more disturbing the more closely we examine them. Because, according to those Sumerian accounts, the Anunnaki didn't arrive on Earth planning to create human-Anunnaki hybrid beings, or to wage civil war over the rights and autonomy of created species. They came with straightforward objectives to extract resources and establish colonies. But, over time, their presence here became complicated by unintended consequences, by beings developing attachments and loyalties that crossed factional lines, by created species developing consciousness and autonomy beyond what their creators had anticipated or desired, by philosophical disputes about rights and obligations escalating into political conflicts, by those political conflicts hardening into intractable opposition between factions with fundamentally incompatible visions of how society should be organized and who should have power within it. And, eventually, by the deployment of weapons that were supposed to serve as deterrents, but that were actually deployed in combat when one side or the other decided that destroying everything was preferable to accepting defeat or allowing the other faction's vision to prevail. We're watching this exact trajectory unfold in our own time, with debates about artificial intelligence rights and autonomy, with competing visions for how genetic engineering should be regulated and who should benefit from enhancement technologies, with political polarization intensifying rather than resolving, as technology gives each faction better tools for propaganda and mobilization, with weapons becoming more sophisticated and more autonomous, while the threshold for their use paradoxically lowers, because precision targeting and reduced collateral damage make warfare seem more acceptable and controllable than the indiscriminate devastation of previous generations' weapons. And with each technological breakthrough bringing us closer to capabilities that could fundamentally alter human nature or human society in ways that cannot be reversed if we discover we've made catastrophic mistakes. The unidentified aerial phenomena that have been acknowledged by military and intelligence services worldwide. Objects demonstrating flight characteristics that violate our understanding of physics and propulsion systems. Objects that have been tracked on radar and observed by credible witnesses, but that remain unexplained by any conventional technology we publicly acknowledge possessing, might represent precisely the kind of monitoring and intervention that ancient texts describe when they refer to watchers or guardians, tasked with observing humanity's development and potentially intervening if we approach thresholds that previous experience has shown to be dangerous. And whether these phenomena represent non-human intelligence, breakaway human civilization with access to suppressed technologies, or something else entirely, their apparent increase in frequency and boldness as we approach critical thresholds in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering suggests correlation between our technological trajectory and someone's, or something's, interest in monitoring or potentially influencing that trajectory. The genetic engineering experiments that are now routine in laboratories worldwide, creating human-animal chimeras for organ harvesting, editing human embryos to remove disease genes or potentially enhance capabilities, using CRISPR to modify organisms in ways that will propagate through entire species via gene drive technologies. These aren't hypothetical futures we're debating whether to pursue. They're current realities that have already been implemented. And the fact that we're conducting these experiments without clear ethical frameworks, without international consensus on boundaries, without adequate safety testing to understand long-term consequences, and without apparent regard for the warnings encoded in every ancient text that describes beings creating or modifying other life forms and subsequently losing control of what they've created, suggests either that we haven't actually learned anything from history, or that we've convinced ourselves that our technology is so different from whatever technology the ancient accounts describe, that their warnings don't apply to us. The factional conflicts that characterized Anunnaki civilization, according to Sumerian texts, with Enki advocating for human autonomy and rights, while Enlil insisted on maintaining strict hierarchical control. With different Anunnaki aligning with different factions based on their philosophical positions about created beings and their relationship to their creators. With these philosophical differences eventually escalating into the warfare that triggered or weaponized the catastrophe that became the Younger Dryas. These conflicts mirror precisely the debates we're having now about artificial intelligence alignment, and whether AI systems should be constrained to serve human interests, or should be allowed to develop autonomous goals. About genetic engineering, and whether we should pursue enhancement technologies that might create post-human species, or whether we should restrict modifications to therapeutic applications that maintain essential human nature. About space colonization, and whether we should terraform other planets to suit human needs, or adapt humans to suit planetary conditions. And underlying all of these technical debates are fundamental questions about what rights created or modified beings have, what obligations creators have to their creations, and what happens when the created being's capabilities or interests diverge from those of their creators. We're having these debates now, publicly and acrimoniously, with competing factions forming around different answers, with those factions becoming increasingly entrenched in their positions, and with the technologies in question advancing faster than our ability to reach consensus about how they should be governed. Which is exactly the trajectory that appears to have led to catastrophe the last time civilization reached this level of capability, suggesting that we're not learning from the pattern, but repeating it with minor variations that don't change the fundamental dynamics or likely outcomes. The Doomsday Clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists as a symbolic representation of how close humanity stands to self-inflicted catastrophe, currently reads 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been since its creation in 1947. Moved to this position in January 2023 and maintained there through 2024 due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. With its nuclear implications, the accelerating climate crisis, the development of autonomous weapons systems, advances in synthetic biology that could enable engineered pandemics, and the destabilizing effects of misinformation and artificial intelligence on social cohesion and democratic governance. And this symbolic warning, created by scientists worried about nuclear war, has expanded to encompass all the ways our technological capabilities now exceed our wisdom to control them, which is precisely the situation that ancient texts suggest characterized the period before the Anunnaki's final war, when beings possessed tremendous power but lacked the institutional structures or ethical consensus necessary to prevent that power from being deployed destructively when factional conflicts reached critical intensity. The scientists maintaining the Doomsday Clock are essentially doing what the builders of Göbekli Tepe did, creating a warning intended to make people aware of danger and, ideally, motivate changes in behavior before catastrophe becomes inevitable. But warnings only work if people actually heed them, if they allow the warning to change their trajectory rather than treating it as background noise or somebody else's problem. And our track record on responding to warnings about existential risks has been profoundly discouraging, with climate change warnings being issued for decades while emissions continue increasing, with warnings about nuclear weapons leading to proliferation rather than disarmament, with warnings about pandemic preparedness being issued repeatedly before COVID-19 and then being largely ignored again once the acute crisis passed, suggesting that humans, or at least human civilizations, may be fundamentally incapable of responding to warnings about diffuse or distant threats until those threats become immediate and undeniable, by which point it's often too late to prevent catastrophic outcomes. The message encoded in Göbekli Tepe, if we can learn to read it correctly by combining the astronomical alignments with the symbolic carvings and the context provided by ancient texts describing the same period from different cultural perspectives, appears to be both simpler and more disturbing than the academic debates about Neolithic religion or the origins of agriculture would suggest. Because the message isn't about worship practices or economic transitions. It's a warning that combines astronomical documentation of when the catastrophe occurred with symbolic representation of what happened, showing human-like figures with their heads removed or displaced, showing vultures carrying human remains, showing symbols of destruction and chaos arranged in patterns that connect to specific stellar configurations corresponding to the Younger Dryas impact event, essentially saying to anyone capable of decoding the message that at this specific time, documented by these stellar positions, something catastrophic happened that destroyed the civilization that built this monument, that involved warfare or conflict among powerful beings, that resulted in massive human casualties and civilizational collapse, and that led to this monument being built as memorial and warning, before being deliberately buried to preserve the information while removing it from easy access. creating a time capsule that would only be discovered when future civilization had developed sufficient archaeological and astronomical sophistication to decode the message, which would presumably be approximately the same level of sophistication that enables development of the dangerous technologies that led to the previous catastrophe. The choice we face now, having discovered Göbekli Tepe and begun decoding its message, having developed technologies that match or exceed those described in ancient texts about pre-catastrophe civilization, having organized ourselves into competing factions with incompatible visions for humanity's future and incompatible philosophies about created beings and technological development, and having deployed, or being on the verge of, deploying weapons and technologies capable of causing extinction-level catastrophes, either intentionally through warfare or unintentionally through cascading unintended consequences. This choice is fundamentally the same choice that the Anunnaki apparently faced and failed. Can we develop sufficient wisdom and restraint to prevent our capabilities from destroying us? Can we bridge factional divisions enough to create genuine cooperation on existential risks, rather than allowing competitive dynamics to push us toward increasingly dangerous deployments of increasingly powerful technologies? Can we establish ethical frameworks and institutional structures that constrain how we use genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons before those technologies develop beyond our ability to control them? Or are we simply going to repeat the pattern that appears to have played out before, convincing ourselves that we're different, that our situation is unique, that the warnings from previous iterations don't apply to us, until we reach the point where someone deploys something that cannot be recalled or controlled, and we discover too late that we've crossed a threshold that leads, inevitably, to catastrophe. The archaeological establishment's extreme caution about excavating more of Göbekli Tepe might represent unconscious recognition that what remains buried includes information we're not ready to confront, evidence that would make the connection between ancient catastrophe and current trajectory too obvious to ignore or dismiss, proof that would force us to either change course dramatically or consciously choose to continue toward catastrophe with full knowledge of where we're heading. And perhaps we're collectively choosing to leave most of the site buried for the same reason the original builders buried it. Because confronting the full truth is too psychologically devastating, too threatening to our comfortable narratives about progress and human exceptionalism, too demanding of changes in behavior and policy that would require sacrificing competitive advantages and restraining technological development in ways that feel impossible within current political and economic structures. The site is there, waiting, containing more information than we've yet accessed, and it will remain there whether we choose to excavate it or not, whether we choose to learn from it or not, whether we choose to heed the warning or dismiss it as irrelevant to our supposedly unique situation. But the choice we make about whether to learn from this warning or ignore it may determine whether our civilization produces its own buried monuments for future archaeologists to excavate and puzzle over, while they make the same mistakes we made, while ignoring the same warnings we ignored, while repeating the same pattern that has apparently played out before. In 1994, a farmer kicked a stone, and that stone connected us directly to a moment 12,000 years ago, when beings who possessed capabilities we're only now rediscovering made choices that led to catastrophe on a scale that nearly extinguished all higher life on this planet. And those beings, or their survivors, created Göbekli Tepe to ensure that when future civilizations reached the same level of capability, they would have access to warning about what happened last time, about the consequences of allowing factional conflicts to escalate unchecked, about the dangers of creating or modifying conscious beings without adequate ethical frameworks for governing those relationships, about the impossibility of containing or controlling truly advanced technologies once they've been deployed, about the way competitive pressures between factions override caution and push toward increasingly dangerous escalations, and about the fact that some thresholds, once crossed, lead to cascades of consequences that cannot be prevented or controlled by the same technologies that enabled crossing those thresholds in the first place. We're standing at that threshold now, developing artificial intelligence that may soon exceed human capability across all domains, editing genomes in ways that will propagate through entire species for generations, deploying autonomous weapons that remove human judgment from targeting decisions, pursuing technologies that could fundamentally alter what it means to be human, or conscious, or alive, and doing all of this while factional conflicts intensify rather than resolve, while international cooperation on existential risks weakens rather than strengthens, while the gaps between technological capability and ethical wisdom widen rather than close, and while warnings from scientists and academics and concerned observers are dismissed or ignored by political and economic leaders who prioritize short-term competitive advantages over long-term survival of the species or civilization or planetary biosphere. Göbekli Tepe isn't just an archaeological mystery to be solved through patient excavation and careful analysis. It's an urgent message from the previous iteration of this cycle. A warning that says, we've been here before. That beings who were more advanced than we are faced the same choices we're facing. That they made the wrong choices and paid catastrophically for those mistakes. That they tried to preserve the warning for us through monuments and texts and myths. And that whether we learn from their mistakes or repeat them is entirely up to us. But that the trajectory we're currently following leads to the same destination they reached. And that destination is catastrophe on a scale that will make the younger Dryas look gentle by comparison. If we deploy technologies more powerful than cosmic impacts while being just as divided and just as willing to prioritize factional victory over species survival as the Anunnaki apparently were when they fought their final war. The warning is carved in stone, documented in texts, embedded in myths, visible in archaeological evidence, undeniable in geological records. And we can choose to heed it by fundamentally changing how we develop and govern powerful technologies, by prioritizing cooperation over competition on existential risks, by developing wisdom at least as rapidly as we develop capability, or we can choose to ignore it, to convince ourselves that our situation is different, that the warnings don't apply to us, that we're special or unique, or somehow exempt from the patterns that govern how civilizations rise and fall and destroy themselves. And if we make that choice, if we continue on our current trajectory, then we're not just risking repetition of what happened before, we're guaranteeing it, ensuring that some future archaeologist from whatever species or civilization comes after us, will excavate our buried monuments and marvel at how we had all the warnings we needed, how we understood the dangers we faced, how we possessed the knowledge necessary to choose differently, and how, despite all of that knowledge and all those warnings and all that understanding, we made exactly the same choices, deployed exactly the same technologies, fought exactly the same factional conflicts, and suffered exactly the same catastrophic consequences as every civilization that has reached this threshold before us. Because we learned nothing from the stone circles that shouldn't exist. Nothing from the gods who walked among hunters. Nothing from the war that broke the sky. Nothing from the burial of memory. And nothing from the warning carved in stone that has been waiting 12,000 years for us to finally learn to read.